Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Terry Hovey, pastor of First Baptist Church in Higgins, Texas. And today I want to bring to you number 2 in our Arise and Build series. And this is titled, Do the Work, Make a Difference. You know, I'm going to make a guess about you today. Something that my guess is that something really bothers you when you see it in the world. Some injustice, or maybe it's something that just is really weighing on you and it really bothers you, maybe on behalf of other people. You know, it could be that maybe you see a need. You see a need and you're thinking that someone should do something about it. Or maybe it's a group of people who are hurting. A group of people being abused maybe some way. Maybe you know of a brother or sister in Christ who is being neglected in some way, and the church doesn't appear to be involved in any sort of remedy for them. You know, something like this, these things that are burden you like this. And those things like that, I would call them divine burdens. When you're bothered about something, you see something that needs to be done and it doesn't look like anything's being done, and you wonder, why isn't someone doing things, you know? It disturbs you on the behalf of God. You know, because they bother you in a very significant way. And you know, something I've noticed when I look at this, and I think that the burden that you bear it often reveals the calling that you'll embrace. The burden you bear often reveals the calling that you will embrace. You know, in other words, the thing that tends to upset you, the squeaky wheel, I guess you could say. The thing that tends to upset you will often drive you or compel you into a ministry to make a difference in the lives of other people. Now, very early in my Christian life, you know, I knew that the Lord had been calling me into Christian ministry, but there were situations and things going on that prevented me one way or another from pursuing that goal immediately. You know, I knew I was called, but I couldn't really get into the ministry immediately. But you know what? That delay really wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't a bad thing at all, because it was during that delay that the Spirit of God was moving in me to study and to prepare for ministry. And also it began this period of germination of a divine burden that would drive me in the future to this very day. You know, you see, it was during this delay that I had the opportunity to sit under different people, the teaching and the preaching ministries of many different men. And from various different denominations, even some of those from what they call non-denominational preachers, you know, and our pastors, and which really, in my mind, is a misnomer, because, you know, all non-denominational churches are driven by they'll follow the lead or the beliefs of their pastor or the other leaders of their body, right? And those leaders, that pastor or those other leaders, they are driven by their previous denominational beliefs. You know, whether it be charismatic or non-charismatic, Arminian or Reformed or whatever. You know, there is really no such thing as a non-denominational church. All that really means is that they don't financially support a specific denomination, but they still represent a certain denomination in one way or in most other aspects, you know. But anyway, the more preachers and the more teachers that I listened to and that I came in contact with, and the more I listened to and actually understood what they were saying, the more I realized that there were a lot of them out there that were very unsound in their theology. You know, and of course, when you've got a pastor or a preacher of a body of Christ, you know, that is theologically unsound, then there's a good chance that there are many within that church body that are also theologically unsound, because the pastor still got a job, right? You know, so they're letting him get by with that, and so that there are many within that body that are theologically unsound, and they're listening to and they are following error. And the more I heard the more I listened to preachers speaking untruth from the pulpit, the greater my burden became to counteract this thing that I saw. It really bothered me when I heard such error being spouted out from the pulpits of American churches and over the airwaves and over the television shows and everything else. But this became my divine burden. It became my divine burden. And it's what drives me to this day. And there's something else that I discovered when looking back at this process that brought me to this point where I'm at today. I discovered that you rarely know when you are at the beginning of something. You rarely know when you're at the beginning of it. You know, I had no idea back then that this discomfort that I felt when I was listening to certain preachers and teachers back in the day, you know, that this was the beginning of where I'm heading now. You know, and it's entirely possible that today there are some of you sitting out there or listening to my voice or watching me right now on video. There are some of you who may, you know, you're at the beginning of something in your life right now too. You know, you may not know it yet, but one day you may look back and think, you know, that's when this all started for me. You know, so you may already be at the beginning. You may be at your beginning, and you see something that needs to get done, but there's no one doing it, and you're wondering why doesn't someone do something, and so you may be wondering you know. So you see, and you're thinking, well, maybe I need to do this, but you're confused about how to actually get started. And you're really bothered about it, but you don't know how to begin. And so you see this need, and it's not being addressed, and you're beginning to wonder that maybe you are the one who needs to do something about it. But how do you start? How do you start? Well, if you'll remember last week when we started this message series, Arise and Build, we were looking at the story of Nehemiah. And, of course, his story actually began around 140 years earlier when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah and then destroyed and pillaged Jerusalem and took thousands of Jews into captivity. He completely destroyed the wall. He burned the gates. He razed the city. He dismantled the temple. Now, fast forward 70 years after that. The Persian king Cyrus, he began this process then of returning those Jews that had been carried away back to their land. Those who wanted to go back home, they let them go. And so they're finally released in order to return from their captivity, in order to return to Judah and to rebuild it and establish their homeland again. But all around them were enemies who were opposed to this, and they did everything that they could to stop the Jews from returning and rebuilding. So after a series of starts and stops over the years, the people who returned, they finally hit a dead end. They hit a wall. They just couldn't find, or they just couldn't finish the project that was before them, and they couldn't get anything going. They were stalled. And so now, 140 years or so after the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity, some 70 years after those Jews had started to return, an everyday, ordinary guy named Nehemiah, he received a divine burden from the Lord, much like what we were talking about at the beginning of this message just now, a few minutes ago. He saw something needed to get done, no one was doing it, and it really wore on him. It burdened him. So he wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a king. He was just an everyday, regular old guy. Matter of fact, we don't hear anything about him anywhere else in the Bible except this book. But he was willing to be used by God. He was willing to be used by God. And so God gave him a passion to do something because no one else was doing anything. And so his heart was broken over the situation that the Jews found themselves in Jerusalem. And when he heard about it, first thing he did was he sat down and he cried. He sat down and he cried. He wept and mourned and fasted and called out to God about what wasn't happening. And then He knelt down and he prayed. Now, 12 different times we mentioned how that the book of Nehemiah mentions him petitioning God about something, going to God and praying, and then finally, after he cried about it and he prayed about it, he finally then stood up and he acted. You can cry and pray about something, but if you're not willing to actually get up and do, it ain't going to get done. So he decided that someone had to do something, and that someone might as well be himself. So after you've been broken, and after you've been crushed and given a burden to do something that needs to get done, you've cried about it, you've prayed about it, you've stood up to start the act of it, but what now? What now? How do you carry it out? How do you carry on? After that Spirit of God, after the Holy Spirit of God has moved upon you and He's given you this mission before you, how do you do the work? Well, I want to give you three thoughts that I discovered when reading through this story. And they're going to be very practical thoughts, points that we need to remember to do to get you started, to get you beginning. And it begins with, number one, you seek God faithfully. You seek God faithfully. Now I touched on this a little bit last week when I was talking about the 12 different prayers that we have recorded for Nehemiah in this book. 12 different prayers. And how this shows that he was a man of prayer who had a lifetime of experience. Because, like I said, if you see one recorded prayer, there's chances are, there are going to be hundreds and hundreds of other prayers that aren't recorded, right? Kind of like mice. You see one mouse, there's a whole lot more you don't see, right? So anyway, time and time again, we see Nehemiah going before God in prayer, and he's praying long prayers, he's praying short prayers, and he's praying these little, what you could call text message prayers, right? Where you lift your eyes to heaven and say, Lord, help me. Lord, give me strength, or give me the words, little text message prayers. And his life and his story show us that he placed a very high value on prayer. And in fact, I want to also take a look at the timelines that are involved here. It really emphasizes, I think, his attitude toward prayer and toward communicating with God. Because in chapter 1, verse 1, we read, "Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year." Now that's the 20th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes. So, and then we skip down to verse 4, and it says, "When I heard these words," now these words that he heard are found in verses 2 and 3, right, where he's talking to his brother about the people who returned to Jerusalem. And so now in verse 4 it says, "When I heard these words, I sat down and I wept, and I mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." So Nehemiah gets this bad news about the Jews in Jerusalem being stalled, and they haven't finished anything there except for maybe the temple, right? And so he gets this bad news about Jerusalem in the month of Kislev, and he started weeping and mourning and fasting and praying. And I'm thinking he kept this process going until we get to the second chapter, verse 1, which says the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Now, to give you a picture of the time frame that's involved, the time of year here that's involved here, Kislev would be around our months of November and December. And then Nisan would be around our months of March and April. But according to the Hebrew calendar, between Kislev and Nisan, you've got the months of Tevet, Shevat, and Adar. So, depending upon the actual day within the month of Kislev that Nehemiah talked to his brother, could have been the first of the month, right? Or could have been anywhere in there. And then the month of Nisan when he actually went to the king. Depending on those days, Nehemiah spent anywhere between 3 to 5 months in this process of weeping and mourning and fasting and praying. You know, all this time he is hurting, he is praying, he is seeking God faithfully. Why? Or why for so long? Well, because he's asking God for the words to guide his words, to guide his steps. Because he not only is under great burden for the people, but he's also in a pretty tricky situation with the king. Now, you see, part of a cupbearer's job is, or actually part of any servant's job, is to make their master's life, or in this case, the king's life, easier. The servant is to make the master's life easier, right? But it's not his job to add burdens to him. He's supposed to take burdens off of him, to make his life easier, to make him safe, right? Drink the wine before the king would, so that, in case there's any poison in it, kind of thing. But every servant of the king would want to be the one who only delivered good news to him. He wouldn't want to deliver bad news. You don't want to upset the king. So no one, like I said, no one wants to be the bearer of bad news to a Middle Eastern king. So notice what Nehemiah then says about his demeanor whenever he's in the presence of the king. He said in Nehemiah 2:1, "Now I had not been sad in his presence." So folks, this says a lot. This says a whole lot, because even with the relationship that Nehemiah apparently had with this king, he still guarded against being sad in his presence or being any kind of downer, right? So when after 3 to 5 months of fasting and weeping and mourning and fasting and praying, after 3 to 5 months of this, it began to show. It began to show on his expression, on his mannerisms. And it was wearing on him, right? And the king noticed. The king noticed. He said in verse 2, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Do you see the intimacy here also? This is very intimate here, because the relationship between him and the king was so close that the king was bothered to see that his servant was upset about something. He was bothered, and he knew that this upset, these tears that were on his face, was more than just tears there because he'd been cutting onions, right? He knew it was more than that. He knew it was a heart thing. That shows that intimacy between them. He says, and so then the king asked, after Nehemiah told him what was going on, after he unloaded to the king about his people in Jerusalem and how they were stalled, then in verse 4, the king asked him, "What would you request? What would you request? How can I help you? How can I be of service to you, Nehemiah?" Isn't that cool? And then Nehemiah we find him doing, again, what he always does. It says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven." Now he had been praying for months, right? Weeping and mourning and fasting and praying. And so he was all prayed up. And so now he could send up one of those text message prayers, because he was already all prayed up. He'd been faithfully seeking God. So he said, "God, help me. God, direct me," before he began to speak to the king. And folks, if God has given you a mission, a burden to do something, and you want to do the work, and you want to make a difference, then seek God faithfully. And then after that, number 2, define your vision clearly. Define your vision clearly. Now, one of the reasons why people get bogged down or unable to start isn't so much because they don't have a clear idea of what their mission or what their vision is. It's because their lack of caring isn't the real issue. It's a lack of clarity. It's not that they don't care, it's just that they're not clear. One of the greatest hindrances to achieving a goal is not having a target to aim at. Take sports analogies, if you would. What's the point in running a football up and down a field if there's no end zones? What's the point of shooting a basketball up in the air if you don't have a goal, a basket to aim at? After the king asked Nehemiah in verse 4, what would you request? He didn't beat around the bush. He didn't hem and haw. He didn't go, he didn't talk about this and about that and just bore the king to death with all kinds of details and everything to finally get to his point. And have you ever had someone do that with you? He's trying to explain something to you and you're sitting here going, oh yeah, come on, man, come on. Nehemiah didn't do that. He didn't do that. He responded with crystal clear clarity. He said in verse 5, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. If it pleases the king, send me to Judah, that I may rebuild it. Crystal clear clarity. One sentence. Seek God faithfully, define the vision clearly. And so what is it that you want to do? What is your burden? Is it helping children? Okay, great. Help them how? Is it feeding them? Is it clothing them? Is it medical care? Housing? Can you define, is it poor children? Can you define poor? Is it homeless children or orphans? Can you target a specific group of children in a city instead of the whole nation or a state? A city, or maybe just an area for the time being in the city, just a zone. You see, you have to ask yourself these kind of questions in order to get practical in your ministry, because you have to know you have to be able to define what it is that God is laying on your heart. You got to start somewhere. And so the more specific that you get, the easier it is for you to start. The more you can narrow things down, the more likely it is you'll begin. So you take baby steps first, because then adult steps will follow, and then the jogging, and then the running. But baby steps first. If God is calling you to something, folks, if He's calling you to something, then define the parameters. Define parameters. Make it specific. Because if you can't define it, then you can't do it. And the less specific you are in its parameters, then the less likely you'll even start. Is God leading you, for instance, to be completely debt-free, except maybe for mortgage, by the year 2025 or 2030? Well, okay, that's clear, and that's definable, and so it is probably doable. Is the Holy Spirit leading you to spark a conversation, for example? Spark a conversation about Christ with each of your students before the end of the school year. Well, you probably need to be cautious in your approach because of our judicial and our political climate, but this is definable, it's specific, and it can be done. In a sentence, what is it that God is calling you to do? Well, seek Him faithfully in it and define it clearly. And then the third thing you need to do is make plans carefully. Make plans carefully. Because folks, honestly, a goal without a plan is simply a wish. A goal without a plan is just a wish. Now, are you wishing or are you planning? We'll honor God and start planning. Honor Him and start planning, because sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is to get organized. To get organized, start planning, because that is right in line with the nature and the being of our God whom we serve, right? Because He is an organized God. He is a very systematic God. If you don't believe me, just look around you. Just look around you. Our planet is part of a system, right? A solar system. And our solar system, all the other planets within the solar system, we revolve around our sun, right? Well, our planet also revolves around that sun, and because we have a very specific speed of rotation around the sun, and also we have a speed of rotation on our own axis while we're going around the sun, that every rotation around the sun equals to a year. And every year, our planet rotates on its axis around the sun a little over 365 times in that year. And then, because it's a little over 365 times, at every 7 years, we add a day to our calendar in order to make up for that accumulated little over time, right? It accumulates, and every 7 years we add another day to our calendar, which we just did, just this last February. It's February 29, leap year. So our entire universe is organized and systematic. God made it that way. You couldn't study it if it wasn't organized. You couldn't make plans if it isn't systematic. So when Nehemiah now approached the king, he made his request. He also had a plan all laid out. He had a plan in mind, and it was all laid out because he had spent months praying and fasting and mourning about this, right, and thinking about it. The king, with his queen sitting by him at the table, he asked Nehemiah in verse 6, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" Very specific questions, wasn't it? Very specific. And I want you to notice that Nehemiah, he didn't say, well, I don't know, king, I'll have to get back with you on that. I hadn't really thought that far out, right? He didn't do that. No, he said he had it already all planned out, because in verse 6, at the end of it, it says, I gave him a definite time. I gave him a definite time. Now, we don't know what that time was. We don't know what the time frame was because it's not recorded. But he gave him a definite time to the king, right? And so then he went into even more detail about his plans, because in verses 7 through 8, we read where Nehemiah tells the king, "And if it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the forest, which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I'll go." So he had this all planned out, and he made very specific requests of the king. He asked, first off, for papers, and then he asked for provision. Now, he's very clear. He needed the papers, or letters, if you would, from the king, so that when he went, which basically told these governors of the surrounding states around Judah that when they're traveling through it, to back off, to let these people, let Nehemiah and his group to pass through without any issues, without any trouble. Those Jews had enemies surrounding them. And those enemies would have places along the roadways and the highways coming to and from that area, going through these other lands. And they would have they would have posts or soldiers or whatever who would stop travelers to check their papers, to find out what they're in the area for, what they're doing, what they're up to. And they wouldn't want any kind of, advantage or assistance to go to their enemies, which in this case would have been the Jews. So papers would give Nehemiah the authority that he needed to travel through unmolested. But along with the papers, the king had the foresight to also give Nehemiah protection, to give him protection. He also sent along some soldiers to make his journey safe. Nehemiah 2 verse 9 says, "The king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen." Now I'm sure that he did this because he, the king, knew very well that when Nehemiah got further and further away, further and further away from the throne, that it would be far too easy for one of these governors to get all angry and everything and to just kill these intruders, burn up the papers, and then when they got called on, say, "Oh, really? "Oh, I'm sorry, King. They didn't show me no papers. They just started shooting at us. So we had to take care of our own." So, it would have been so easy for them to do that. So the king not only gave him the authority to go through those lands, but he also gave him the power of the king, right? With these troops following along with them. Then Nehemiah asked for provision. He wouldn't be able to complete his mission without the materials that he needed to finish the mission. He had to have the provision. There was going to be a lot of lumber that was needed. And to build the gates and to build the fortress, which was the house that overlooks the temple area. In Jesus' day, that would have been the fortress of Antonia, where Pilate had his housing, right? And they would also need lumber for the supports of the wall. There was a lot of need for lumber. Lumber, though, was a very precious commodity. Very precious commodity. And the forests, they were carefully guarded. And so without permission then to start logging operations, the whole project would just end in futility. So Nehemiah asked for papers, he asked for provision, and he got something else that he didn't even ask for. He got protection. Why? Well, because verse 8, the good hand of God was on me. The good hand of God was on me. He sought the Lord, and he was led by the Spirit of the Lord, and our God is able to provide abundantly beyond what we ask. And Ephesians 3:20, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. Nehemiah got everything that he needed and then some. Right? Because God was with him. Because Nehemiah was willing to be a vessel, to be led by the Lord, he had the favor of the Lord. And he moved upon the heart of the king. And then if you have a burden for something like Nehemiah did, if there's something that is consuming you, your thoughts, a need or a ministry that should be happening but isn't, well, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you've got a burden for this, there's no accident. That's no accident that you've got a burden, right? Because, folks, as Christians, we don't have fate. We don't have luck. We don't have chance. There's no such thing in the vocabulary in the life of a Christian, because we have a God who is in complete control, and he interacts with us, and he steps out of time and space and moves within our lives today. And if you have a burden, then it has been given to you by him. And because that burden that you bear will reveal the call that you embrace. That burden that's given by him is your call upon your life by the God that we serve. So seek God faithfully for this burden. Seek him faithfully. Define your vision clearly. And when you got those things down, then you have a beginning and an end, basically. Then you can start making plans carefully that will get you to your goal. But it could be. It could be that the burden that you're bearing is more along the lines of that you need to get right with God. Maybe that is your burden right now. First things first, right? You know that you got to get right with God, because maybe you haven't given your life to him yet, and you know that you're away from him, that you are not with him as you should be. You've got this burden, you've got this thing within you that you need to fill. First things first. This discomfort that you're feeling, this uneasiness that you're feeling. Well, what that is the Spirit of God who is moving in your life, and he is pulling you along the way to commit your life to Christ. He wants you to commit your life to Christ because you know that he gave up his own life for you on the cross, don't you? You know that. Because people have told you that. I have preached on that. I have told you over and over and over again that he gave up his life for you, so that you wouldn't have to pay the debt that you owed for your sins. And because he did that for you, if you will receive him, if you will place your faith and your trust in Jesus Christ, then you don't have to worry about getting right with God, because you will be made right with God through faith in the Son of God who gave himself for you. So if you haven't done that yet today, first things first, give your life to Jesus. Pray something like this: Lord, forgive me, I'm a sinner. Please come within my heart and save me, forgive me, make me totally new. Now, those aren't magic words, but words like that need to be spoken by you from the heart to God. Won't you do that today? Believe in Jesus Christ and give your life to him. That is your burden right now. That is your call. Answer it.